Hello everyone. I'm going to make a video where I walk through practice problems relating to shifts in the supply and demand curve. So you should have seen a Prezi from Blackboard on demand and supply. And if you go through that Prezi, one of the parts of it is this what I called a real world example, and there's a link to an audio clip talking about, it's from the radio, and it has a chicken producer talking about some of the variables, the ceteris paribus factors that affect demand and supply for chicken. And so then I translated some of the audio into specific supply and demand questions, similar to something you might see on a homework or on an exam. And so I'm going to work 5 of these problems for you, just so you can get used to the process of drawing shifts in supply and demand, and you can see what I'm looking for when I assign these types of problems to you. Okay, so I've copied these same questions over into my whiteboard, and I'm going to attempt to draw the shifts of the curves. I'm not good yet with drawing on this computer, but I'll do my best. So the first question, so if you haven't listened to that audio clip and you haven't gone through the demand and supply Prezi, I highly recommend that you do that first. This should be more of a review for you, just to really get comfortable with these types of problems. But the first question said, what would happen in the market for chicken if the price of beef went down? So the first thing to note here is that there's most likely a relationship between chicken and beef. And I would venture to say that the relationship between chicken and beef is that they are substitutes for one another. So in other words, if a consumer switches to buying more beef, then they are going to buy less chicken because they will be substituting beef for chicken. So in this question, with the price of beef going down, let me make a little summary. We've got the price of beef decreasing will cause the quantity demanded of beef to increase. And that's just something we know from the law of demand. We know that whenever the price of a good decreases, the quantity demanded of that good increases. So people are going to be buying more beef when the price of beef goes down. Okay, and since chicken we're going to call a substitute for beef, as consumers switch to buying more beef, they are going to be buying less chicken. So we would expect the decrease in the price of beef to cause a decrease in the demand for chicken. So that's kind of the key piece of information you have to determine before drawing anything on a graph. You have to figure out which curve is shifting and in which way it would be shifting. So we've determined that the demand for chicken is decreasing. Graphically, a decrease in demand is the same thing as a shift of the demand curve to the left. You always want to think about shifts of supply and demand curves in terms of shifting to the left or to the right, not up or down. So you never want to say a decrease in demand causes a shift downward. It always causes a shift leftward. So a decrease in demand shifts the demand curve to the left. An increase in supply shifts the curve to the right. Okay, so in this particular example, we are going to be shifting our demand curve for chicken to the left. Just gonna make a few notes about this graph that I already have set up here. This is kind of the starting point for all of these problems. So the first thing you should do whenever you're answering a shift of supply or demand question is to draw an original demand curve, which is going to be a downward sloping line, and I've labeled it D1 to denote that this is our first or original demand curve. Then you want an upward sloping supply curve, S1. So they're going to make an X. They're going to cross in the shape of an X. Okay, and then you want to label on the price axis, you want to label your equilibrium price, P star 1. This is your original equilibrium price. And then label your original equilibrium quantity, Q star 1. So before you even begin a problem, you want to draw this first. And then something else I'll add here is that we are dealing in the market for chicken. It's important to note what market you're in because our graph for the market for beef would look different than the market for chicken. So we want to make sure we're specific about what we're talking about. We're talking about the market for chicken. Okay. So next I'm going to draw my decrease in demand. I'm going to draw a new demand curve somewhere to the left of my original demand curve. Doesn't have to be pretty, but there's a new demand curve, and I'm going to draw a little arrow to denote that I've shifted my curve to the left. Notice the arrows are pointing to the left, not down, because a shift in a curve occurs along this quantity axis. It shifts to the left or the right, not up or down. Okay, so that's the first step. Now, a lot of students want to jump to labeling the new equilibrium point, price, and quantity, but I highly recommend that you hold off on that and go through the steps in the same order that I'm about to go through them. So first, you want to draw your new curve, in this case, our new demand curve. I'm going to label it just to keep everything straight later on. Okay, I'm going to call it D2 because my original one was called D1, and now we have a D2. Okay, the next step after you've drawn your shift is to pay attention to this original equilibrium price level. So this little gray line denotes that price across the graph, and I could extend it even further over here if I needed to. So I want to look at this horizontal original P star 1 equilibrium price line. And I want to determine whether the shift of my curve, in this case of my demand curve, whether it caused a shortage or a surplus of chicken in the market. Because the basic story we're telling in all of these problems is that we had a market that was in equilibrium right here. Then something changed, some variable outside of our model changed. In this case, the change was a change in the price of beef, a change in the price of a substitute good for chicken. Okay, excuse that warning. I just noticed my battery's about to run out, so let me plug that in. This is like a real lecture for you guys, complete with errors. All right. So at this original equilibrium price, I want to determine what if I have a shortage or a surplus. Sorry, I got off track there. I'm going to zoom in for labeling purposes to that equilibrium price line, and then I'll zoom back out after I'm finished. Okay, so or maybe I need to zoom out a little more so that we can see our information. All right, remember that this black line right here, this was our original demand curve, but it got shifted to the left. It got pushed this way. And so all of my quantity demanded, a demand curve is just a set of quantity demanded points at different prices. And so when I shift my demand curve, I'm shifting all my consumers' quantity demanded points to the left. And so in other words, when my demand curve got shifted from the black line to the green line, my quantity demanded, which was originally over here when we first began in equilibrium. In fact, let me show you that. At the beginning, we would have said, if a market's in equilibrium right here, that the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. So before the shift of the curve, my QD and my QS were equal. That's the definition of equilibrium. Quantity demanded, quantity supplied were both over here at the beginning of this problem. But then something happened that threw me out of equilibrium. Something caused a change. And that change was that the demand curve got shifted to the left. So it threw the equality of this QD and QS out the window. It shifted quantity demanded. So quantity demanded got shifted over here to this green line. Okay, it was here, but then the shift of the demand curve moved quantity demanded over here. And remember, we're always just looking at our original equilibrium price. That's what we care about. Because in economics, things happen in a sequential order, only changing one at a time. So no prices have changed yet in this market. They're still at their original price level. All that's changed is that demand got shifted over here, and with it, so did quantity demanded. Okay, the other problems will go faster. I'm just spending a little time explaining for those of you who don't get to be in lectures with me. Okay, so here's what's happened. My quantity supplied and quantity demanded were over here. Quantity demanded got shifted to the left. And so now at this original equilibrium price, I have a quantity supplied, which is to the right or greater than my quantity demanded. In other words, more people, there's more units of the chicken that suppliers want to sell at this price than there are consumers who want to buy that chicken. There's too much chicken, not enough people wanting to buy it. We call that situation where QS is greater than QD, we call that a surplus. So this shift of the demand curve to the left has caused a surplus of chicken in the market. The quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So there's too much chicken. All right, and the thing about surpluses is that they put pressure on the price of a good to drop. And I always tell students, I think of a surplus as being like if you picture bananas or something like that, and there's a surplus of bananas. Well, those bananas are just sitting on the shelf. Suppliers are wanting to sell them at that price, but buyers aren't wanting to buy them at that price. And these bananas are just going rotten. So there's pressure for the price of the bananas to be dropped or to lower, to go down, so that more people will be willing to buy those rotting bananas before they're completely rotten and not able to be sold. So a surplus puts market for essentially a clearance or for the price of the good to drop. And I'm just using that as an analogy. It's not technically correct, but helps students to remember that a surplus puts pressure on the price of the good to go down. So, and what happens when the price of a good drops? Well, we move downward along a demand curve and downward along a supply curve. Whenever the price of the good we're talking about, in this case chicken, is changing, you don't shift your curves. You just move from one point to another on your demand curve or your supply curve. So what's basically happening is my quantity demanded, as the price of chicken begins to fall, we move downward along the new demand curve, and we move downward along the supply curve. In other words, my quantity supplied decreases, my quantity demanded increases, and that continues to happen until you meet this little point right here. That point right there, which of course is going to be our new equilibrium. So at this point, my quantity demanded has increased to the point where it is now equal to my quantity supplied. So we're back in equilibrium. QS is equal to QD once again. And that happened as a result of the drop in price that got rid of the surplus of chicken. Okay, so now I can label my new equilibrium. And so the reason I recommend students wait is because if you had already labeled this price line, then a lot of times when you go to label your surplus up here, people get confused because they don't know which price line to look at. So I recommend labeling your surplus, your QS and your QD, or your shortage before you go on to label that second equilibrium. All right, so let's see, I'll use black for this. So I'm going to draw a little line here a little line here. And I'm going to label my new equilibrium price. Right there. And my new equilibrium quantity. Okay. All right, so we can see, looking at this change from P star 1 to P star 2, that the price of chicken as a result of this situation would be expected to fall from P star 1 down to P star 2. And then the quantity went from Q star 1 to Q star 2. So it also decreased. Went this way, left, which is a decrease on the quantity axis. So we would expect, as a result of the decrease in demand for chicken, in the end, the equilibrium price of chicken would fall and the equilibrium quantity of chicken would also fall. So that's saying that we would expect chicken to be sold at a lower price than it was before, and we would expect a lower amount of it to be bought and sold than before the shift in demand. So that's kind of the summary or the end result of the shift. Okay, now when you see a question like this in my class on an exam, it's probably going to be either a fill in the blank or a short answer response or a matching. Those are the three possibilities. But all three of those possibilities will come in the exact same style. So I'll show you what I mean. The things I would this is what a typical answer to a question like this would look like on a homework or on an exam. I would say something like, the decrease in the price of beef causes the, and then I would put a blank curve for chicken to shift to the blank. Something like that. Okay, and you would have to fill in the blanks or select the appropriate thing to go in those blanks, whatever the case may be. And of course, in this case, the answer would be that the decrease in the price of beef caused the demand curve for chicken to shift to the left. So the demand curve shifted to the left. That would be the first part. The second part would say something like, this shift causes the blank to exceed the blank, resulting in a blank for chicken. Okay, and what I'm looking for here, I'm trying to see whether or not you understand how to determine whether a shortage or a surplus exists in the market after the shift. So that's why we label this part right here, the QS and the QD and the surplus. So the answer in this case would be, the shift of the demand curve to the left caused the quantity supplied to be greater than or to exceed the quantity demanded for chicken, which resulted in a surplus. QS greater than QD means surplus. So over here I would fill in, this shift causes the quantity supplied, or QS, to exceed the quantity demanded, resulting in a surplus. I guess I should say surplus of, not for. Surplus of chicken. So that would be the second part. Okay. Then I would say something like, oh no. See if I can get zoomed back in. All right. Next thing I would say would be something like, This puts pressure on the price of chicken to blank. So I'm asking you, as a result of the surplus or shortage, what happened to price? And in this case, since there was a surplus, there was pressure for the price to go down or to decrease or to fall. Any of those would be an appropriate response. So this puts pressure on the price of chicken to decrease. Okay. And then the last part would say, in the end, the equilibrium price of chicken would blank and the equilibrium quantity of chicken would blank. And here I'm just asking you for the overall ultimate effects of the shift in demand, which was that the price, the equilibrium price decreased and the equilibrium quantity also decreased. So the equilibrium price of chicken would decrease and the equilibrium quantity of chicken would also decrease. So those are the typical, that's the typical format you would be tested on these kind of questions, because I won't be able, especially if you're an online student, I won't be able to really see your graphs, and which would tell me, you know, if you were understanding all of this. So I have to put it in this format over here so that I can kind of pick out parts of your graph to make sure you're understanding all the components. So this is a very typical exam and homework supply and demand question. All right, so now let's go through a few more examples. I'll go much faster on these next ones, so bear with me. All right, the next question said, what would happen in the market for chicken if the cost of chicken feed decreased? Okay, so the first step is determining which of the 10 determinants of supply and demand. There's 5 variables or determinants you need to know that can shift a demand curve, and there's 5 variables you need to know that can shift a supply curve, and those are in your textbook. And so you'll need to have those memorized or be familiar with them. Okay, in this case, we're dealing with a variable that shifts the supply curve because the cost of chicken feed is what's changing. And chicken feed is an input in the production of chicken. You have to feed chickens in order to be able to ultimately sell them in the market. So we're talking about a change in the price of an input, and that's going to shift the supply curve for chicken. All right, and so the basic rule I tell students for shifts of supply is just to think, okay, is what's happening good for suppliers or bad for suppliers? Good for producers, bad for producers. So obviously the cost of chicken decreasing is a good thing for producers. It's saying it's cheaper for them to produce chicken. So if whatever's happening is good for suppliers, then they're going to increase their supply. And if whatever was happening was bad, they would decrease their supply. So in this case, the decrease in the cost of chicken feed is good for producers, and so they are going to increase their supply of chicken. So I'm going to draw a new supply curve somewhere to the right, because an increase in supply means a shift of my supply curve to the right. All right, so let me label my new supply curve S2. All right, so that's the first step. We've determined that the change of the ceteris paribus factor, cost of inputs, shifts the supply curve to the right. The next step is to determine whether or not that shift causes a shortage or a surplus at the original equilibrium price. So I've got my original equilibrium price line. I'm going to need to extend it a little bit in this case. I'm going to just extend it over there. And then I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can label my QS and my QD. All right, so remember, before the chicken feed variable changed, we were in equilibrium. We were at this original equilibrium point where QS and QD were equal. Everything was perfect in this market. Right? QS was equaling QD. So they were both over here at this intersection point of the original supply and demand curve. Okay, but when my supply curve shifted to the right, my quantity supplied shifted with it. Doop, 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 way over here at this little point right here. So at this original equilibrium price, after the shift of the curve to the right, my quantity supplied got pushed way over here. My quantity demanded stayed over here. Quantity demanded didn't move because my demand curve didn't shift. It didn't move. Quantity supplied moved because it's the supply curve that was moving in this case. All right, so at this original equilibrium price, I've got a quantity supplied way over here, quantity demanded over here. So QS is greater or bigger than QD. So I have another case of a surplus. QS is greater than QD. So I have a surplus. More people want to sell chicken at that price than people want to buy at that price. Okay, we know that surpluses put pressure on the price of a good to decrease or drop. So I'm going to drop, the price of chicken is going to start to drop, and as it does, I'm going to move downward along my demand curve, downward along my supply curve, and I'm going to keep doing that until that new equilibrium, that new intersection point is reached. So the surplus drives you down your demand curve, drives the price down, which moves you downward along your demand curve, downward along your supply curve until you get to the new equilibrium. So I'm going to have a new equilibrium price, and then I'm going to have a new equilibrium quantity, which I will label. Okay, so my new equilibrium price is down here. My new equilibrium quantity is here. Okay, so in the end, it looks like my price went from P1 down to P2. It dropped or decreased. And my Q1 went from Q1 over to Q2, so my quantity increased. So my equilibrium price fell and my equilibrium quantity increased. That will always be true with shifts of supply curves, that your price and your quantity, your equilibrium price and quantity, move in opposite directions. And then with demand shifts, your equilibrium price and quantity will move in the same direction. But I always tell students to not memorize this. You really don't need to. As long as you can draw graphs and read your graphs, like I just did. I said, oh, here's P1, here's P2, the price dropped. I didn't need to memorize that an increase in supply causes a drop in price. I could figure it out just by drawing the graph. So I encourage you to just be really good at drawing these graphs and not try to memorize all the effects of the different shifts. Okay, so just as a quick summary of what your answers to this problem would look like, it would be something like this. I'm not going to type it, I'm just going to say it. The answers would be: a decrease in the cost of chicken feed would cause the supply curve for chicken to shift to the right. This shift would cause the quantity supplied to exceed the quantity demanded for chicken, resulting in a surplus in the market for chicken. This would put pressure on the price of chicken to decrease, and in the end, the equilibrium price of chicken would decrease, and the equilibrium quantity of chicken would increase. Okay, so let's move on to the next example. This one says, what happens in the market for chicken wings during Super Bowl or March Madness season? Okay, so notice here, they're not asking us about the market for chicken. They're asking us for the market for chicken wings, so a little more specific. And if you listen to that audio clip that I mentioned at the beginning, that's in the Prezi for supply and demand, it talks about kind of the distinction between the different types of chicken and how they are seasonally affected. So the basic result or implied effect of a Super Bowl March Madness season was that people are more likely to buy and make chicken wings during football and basketball seasons, or I guess, Super Bowl, March Madness seasons. So we would expect during this time for, the demand for chicken wings to increase. And as far as which of the 10 determinants of demand and supply this is, it would be a change in consumer taste and preferences. Because basically, during March Madness and Super Bowl season, consumers prefer chicken wings more than they do at other times of the year. So there's an increase in the taste or preference for chicken at this particular time of year. Okay, but the overall effect would be an increase in demand for chicken wings at that time of year. So I'm going to draw an increase in demand. So this is going to be, stay consistent, and I'll use green. I'm going to draw a new demand curve somewhere to the right of my old demand curve, increasing demand, shifting it to the right. Okay, so here's my new demand curve, T2, shifted to the right. All right, so now let's talk about whether there's a shortage or a surplus created for chicken wings as a result of this shift of the curve. The first thing I'm going to do is extend my original price line a little bit so that it crosses over onto my new demand curve. I'm going to zoom in. Okay. All right, so let's talk about where quantity supplied and quantity demanded are after the shift of the curves. So before the shift, quantity supplied and quantity demanded were equal because we were in equilibrium. Okay. They were both here at this intersection point at equilibrium. But when I shifted my demand curve to the right, my quantity demanded moved over here to the right with the new demand curve. My quantity supplied is still back here at the original equilibrium because my supply curve didn't move, just my demand curve did. Okay, so QD got pushed over this way with the demand curve. Quantity supplied still back here at the original equilibrium price. All right, so this is a case where my quantity demanded is greater than my quantity supplied. So this is a new case we haven't covered yet. Whenever quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, we have what's called a shortage of the good. Shortage of chicken wings in this case. Because more people are wanting to buy the good, there's a higher number of people demanding the good than there are people willing to sell the good at that price. So there's a shortage of chicken wings created as a result of the increase in demand. Okay, and the general way a shortage is resolved is that the price of the good goes up. So surpluses put pressure on the price to decrease, shortages put pressure on the price to increase. Okay, and as price increases, it moves you upward along your demand and supply curves. So my QS was here, but as the price goes up, the quantity supplied increases along the given supply curve. And then as price goes up, quantity demanded moves this way, upward along the demand curve, until they meet at the new equilibrium. Okay. So I've got a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity. Which I'm labeling. All right, so in the end, it looks like here my P1 increases up to P2, so equilibrium price went up, and equilibrium quantity also increases from Q1 up to Q2. So the increase in demand causes an increase in the price, equilibrium price, and an increase in the equilibrium quantity for chicken wings. So your answer would be in this format. During Super Bowl March Madness season, the demand curve for chicken shifts to the right. This shift causes the quantity demanded of chicken wings to exceed the quantity supplied, resulting in a shortage of chicken wings. The shortage puts pressure on the price of chicken wings to increase, and in the end, the equilibrium price for chicken wings increases, and the equilibrium quantity of chicken wings increases. So I encourage you to pause this video, work out these problems yourself if you're feeling like you have it, and see if your answers match what I get. All right, 2 more. What happens in the U.S. market for dark meat when there is an outbreak of avian influenza in the United States? So the audio clip mentioned how avian influenza often results in other countries banning the purchase of dark meat from the United States. So if there's an outbreak of avian influenza, then we would expect, at least temporarily, for the demand for dark meat to decrease. Because he said most of our dark meat in the United States gets exported to other countries. But if they think that there's avian influenza, that they have contaminated meat coming from the United States, they're going to decrease their demand for meat from the United States. They don't want our avian influenza contaminated meat. Okay, so we would expect the demand for dark meat to decrease or shift to the left. Let me just make a note that we are in the market for dark meat here. All right, so demand curve shifts to the left. Let's see whether that caused a shortage or a surplus of dark meat. Well, my quantity demanded and quantity supplied were both at equilibrium to begin with, at that original equilibrium price. But when the demand curve shifted to the left, so did my quantity demanded at that price. So my QS is way over here. My quantity demanded got pushed to the left over here. So I've got QS greater than QD. In other words, I have a surplus of dark meat. There's a bunch of dark meat for sale that foreigners don't want to buy because they think it's contaminated at that price. So this is going to put pressure on the price of dark meat to drop or decrease. And as it does, it's going to move you downward along your demand curve, downward along your supply curve until you get to the new equilibrium point. So you're going to have a new equilibrium price for dark meat and a new equilibrium quantity. So this is my new equilibrium quantity. This is my new equilibrium price. So my price for dark meat would be expected to decrease or drop, and so would my equilibrium quantity, because it was a decrease in demand. All right, so to summarize, an outbreak of avian influenza could be expected to shift the demand curve for dark meat to the left. This would cause the quantity supplied of dark meat to exceed the quantity demanded, resulting in a surplus of dark meat. This would put pressure on the price of dark meat to drop or decrease, and in the end, the equilibrium price of dark meat would decrease, and the equilibrium quantity of dark meat would also decrease. So the main steps to all these problems is identifying which curve is shifting in which direction. So is it the supply or the demand curve shifting to the left or to the right? And then draw that shift and determine whether it causes a surplus or shortage. And then if it's a surplus, the price is going to drop. If it's a shortage, the price is going to increase. And then it's going to move you, it's going to resolve the surplus or shortage and move you towards your new equilibrium point. All right, last one. What happens in the market for chicken if there is a drought? So we're back to talking about the generic market for all chicken. And they say, what happens if there's a drought? Okay, well, a drought is a bad thing for suppliers, right? Drought means there's not a lot of rain. So I know from experience that chickens don't do super well in extreme conditions. So the drought is bad for suppliers. They are going to have a decreased supply in the case of a drought. It will probably kill off a lot of their chickens. So we would expect to see the supply curve for chicken to shift to the left, to decrease. Like that. Okay, so let's talk about whether that shift causes a shortage or a surplus in this market. Well, my quantity supplied was over here at equilibrium, but when my supply curve shifted to the left, so did my quantity supplied. So it's now over there at the original equilibrium price. My quantity demanded hasn't changed because my demand curve didn't shift, it didn't get moved, so it's still over here at the original equilibrium point. So I've got my quantity demanded over here, quantity supplied over here. In other words, quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. So I have a shortage of chicken as a result of the drought. The drought causes a shortage at the original equilibrium price. And we know that shortages put pressure on the price of the good to go up, which moves you upward along your demand curve, upward along your supply curve until you get to the new equilibrium. So the price of chicken goes up to this new equilibrium price. And I have a new equilibrium quantity to go along with it. Let's label P star 2, which is up here. And, oh no. And Q star 2. Right there. Okay, so it looks like equilibrium price increased, equilibrium quantity decreased, went down to the left. Okay, so summary. A drought would cause the supply curve of chicken to shift to the left. This shift would cause the quantity demanded of chicken to exceed the quantity supplied of chicken, resulting in a shortage in the market for chicken. This shortage would put pressure on the price of chicken to increase. So in the end, the equilibrium price of chicken would increase and the equilibrium quantity of chicken would decrease. So notice that since this was a shift in the supply curve, price went up, quantity went down. They moved in opposite directions. Okay, so there are several examples of how I would expect you to go through problems relating to supply and demand. Please let me know if you have any questions or if anything is still kind of fuzzy or confusing to you. Thanks for watching.